So this here is the first page of my folder. It's my word art page, and the words that I chose to stick on the cover come from my philosophy paper. I chose frequently used words and phrases purposefully so that if somebody were to just quickly glance at this, they'd be able to get a really good idea about what my management philosophy is. So I have words on here like respect, logical consequences, positive teacher-student relationships, rules. So again, I just think if somebody were to quickly look at this, they'd be able to get a pretty good idea about what my philosophy is. So this next page talks a little bit more about what was in the philosophy paper, and I mentioned the philosophers who I agree with, who are Marvin Marshall and Kirwan and Mendler. Marvin Marshall, I really liked his responsibility model, and he falls under the high teacher control category. And then Kirwan and Mendler, I liked their whole idea of discipline with dignity, and they fall under the medium teacher control category. And since I agree with things from both of these theories, I would place myself in the medium to high teacher control range. Some things that I like just generally about medium teacher control is that consequences are logical, students can work together, and there isn't a belief that development comes solely from external factors, but also from internal factors as well. And then I think where the high teacher control comes in for me is I want to create a classroom where students are able to choose and are given autonomy, but within that choice, I want it to be structured, so I would give them options and then they could choose from those options. So I think that's really where the high teacher control comes into play for me. And then on the same page, I also talk a little bit about teacher and student roles and responsibilities. So for teachers, I think that the biggest responsibility they have is to create a safe classroom environment. We know that students learn best in this type of an environment. And I think to do this, teachers can focus on creating positive teacher-student relationships and making curriculum accessible to all students, whether that be by making accommodations or including experiences from students' lives, whatever they need to do to make curriculum accessible. And so that's kind of what I believe a teacher's role and responsibility is. Then on the student side, I think just as a teacher comes ready to teach every morning, a student should come ready to learn, and I think students should be responsible and respectful, and when they do that, I think it will help to create that safe learning environment. So I guess a general statement of what my management philosophy is that I want to create a classroom where students are respected and respectful. So I would say that that's kind of my philosophy statement. So page 3 has my foldable on democracy in the classroom. You can see all my different flaps that I have here on the different things we talked about, and I'm not going to go through all the flaps, but just in general, I think it's really important to have a democratic classroom because I think it teaches students life skills that they're going to use as adults as well as right now in the classroom. I know we talked a lot about having classroom morning meetings a lot when we talked about democracy, and I think that it's super important to do these meetings because I think it gives students a chance to learn how to have their own opinions and talk about them in an appropriate way, and also it teaches them how to talk with others about concerns that they may be having, again in an appropriate way where feelings don't get hurt and things like that. So I think it's really important to have those meetings to teach students those skills because they're going to be really important later on in life. And also like class jobs teaches students leadership skills that they're going to need in future careers. I think just overall having a democratic classroom also makes students take more responsibility for their learning, which makes their learning more meaningful to them in the end. So page 4 is about motivation and the different types, intrinsic and extrinsic. So intrinsic motivation, we know it comes from internal factors, and then extrinsic motivation comes from external factors, and I don't think it's fair to say that in your classroom you can only have one or the other. I think that they're very much intertwined, and if you have one, you're going to have the other. Before this class, extrinsic motivation always kind of had a negative connotation for me, but I've since learned that it can actually be a good thing, and you can actually use that type of motivation to move students towards intrinsic motivation. So for example, like giving positive praise is a form of extrinsic motivation that can then transfer into intrinsic motivation, and I think this works because students end up gaining confidence from the praise, and then they feel motivated to do assignments and work by themselves because they feel confident in their abilities. So I think it's important to know the differences between the two types of motivation, but then realize that they kind of go hand in hand and use them positively together. So page 5 talks about rules and the importance of rules. Rules are really important because it lets students know what the expectations are for them. And I also have learned through this class how important it is to get students involved in making the rules. When students are involved and are able to take that responsibility, it's going to motivate them to keep the rules, and it'll just increase their desire to follow the rules. I also know that with rules comes consequences, and I think it's really important to have logical consequences. Students know when you're not being fair, so I think that when making the consequences, it needs to make sense. And there should be positive consequences for when students do something right. They maybe get a reward or something like that, and then negative consequences for when they break a rule, and that needs to be dealt with. But again, I think just the most important thing about rules is that students need to help create them, and the consequences associated with them need to be logical. So this next page talks about procedures and creating positive rapport with students. Procedures are really important because they're set in place to help students know how to accomplish a certain task, and they're used to direct activities, and it provides a predictable structure for students to follow. I think it also helps to really make transitions a lot smoother in the classroom and reduces the amount of chaos, and just overall helps with classroom management. And creating a positive relationship with students is really important because when students know that they're cared for and loved, they're going to learn a lot easier, they're going to want to listen to you a lot more, and again, just helps with classroom management. So to create this positive relationship, it's important to greet students, get to know them, spend time with them, doing things like that, just to help create that bond with students. So page 7 has my flip book with all the different types of intervention, and then on the side it has a list of misbehaviors, and the red arrows point to the intervention I would use, and then down here is just a statement on bullying. So a mild intervention that I may use is if a student is talking during the lesson to another student and is disrupting the class. I could use proximity to help stop the misbehavior. I like the idea of proximity because I think it doesn't embarrass students, and it kind of goes along with Kerwin and Mendler's discipline with dignity theory. And a moderate response that I would use if a student is being really non-compliant, I'm asking them to do a task and they just won't do it. I think I would get them to stay in at recess and finish the task that they didn't finish during class time, just because I think that's a logical consequence, and that's part of moderate response, is giving logical consequences to students. And then for chronic misbehavior, if a student's constantly blurting out answers during class and is always disrupting my flow of teaching, I think what I would do for that is express surprise and disappointment. I think that doing this would really get students to think about their actions and think about what a responsible student would do, which kind of goes along with Marvin Marshall's whole responsibility model. So those are the interventions that I would use. To deal with bullying in my classroom, I think the best way to do it is just have an open conversation about that. I know during our online class on bullying, one of the websites mentioned that. I think that it's important to just have an open conversation about it because I think students need to be clear about what bullying is and how to stop it, and they can't know that if you don't talk about it openly. So if you read my bullying statement down at the bottom of page 7, that's basically what it says. It's just that I think it's really important for students to really understand what bullying is, and to do that you need to talk about it openly in the classroom. So this last page has my classroom map on it, and I'm just going to go over it really briefly. But in my classroom, I want there to be a lot of collaboration and a lot of discussion. I think part of a safe classroom environment is students feeling comfortable to talk to each other, which is why I put students' desks in groups to help encourage discussion between peers. And up here I have a rug, which will be used for class meetings, which will help to promote a democratic classroom where students can voice their opinions and concerns. At the desks, their supplies aren't going to be kept there. They'll go and get their supplies as needed. I think that also helps to create a democratic classroom because each student will be assigned a different job at their table each week, and one will be to go and get supplies or pencils or whatnot. So I think that provides opportunities for classroom jobs, which also helps to create a democratic classroom. And I think just overall the layout of my classroom helps to remove any distractions that students might face, which helps with management. And I talk a lot more about the setup of my classroom in the narrative and how I feel like it really fits with my teaching style. Finally, just in these back few folders, I have my management philosophy paper, my classroom map narrative, and then in this last pocket I have a lot of handouts that we got in class. Like this one's the working with children at different stages. I have the importance of a democratic classroom. I have all sorts of things in here. Classroom procedures handouts, just a ton of different handouts that we got in class. So that's my folder.